There we go. Okay. All right, so my name is Alana. I run Darroch Nurseries, and I'm here with Jacqui Wallace of Knoydart Tree Nursery and Andy Robinson, the Woodland Crofter on Mull. And we're going to share a little bit of our expertise today, or what we've learned so far, basically, with yourselves. So I'm going to start sharing presentation. And I actually need to go to the start of the presentation. That would help. Bear with me. Here we go. Okay. So welcome, everybody. Today, we've got about 3 parts. We're going to do the first bit, which is the workshop on setting up a tree nursery. And then we'll have a look at 3 examples of tree nurseries in Scotland, and then we'll have a Q&A. So about roughly half an hour for each one. So if you could keep your questions for the very end, that would be great. And if you can make sure you stay on mute. We do have a chat function, so you can put thoughts and comments in there. And we're actually going to ask you, before we get started, to tell us more about where you're located and why you want to grow trees, because it'd be really useful to know sort of why folk are here today and the motivations for folk to grow trees, because even between the 3 of us here, we sort of came in at 3 different angles, and we know that within the network of small tree growers, there's lots of different sort of motivations for growing trees. So if you wouldn't mind using the chat function, yeah, just introduce yourselves, tell us where you are and why you're interested in growing trees, please. And I like that first answer, we like growing trees. That's, yeah, join the club. Perfect. Okay, I'm going to move on whilst everyone puts their answers in. We're going to be using a few different terms today, and I just want to make sure that everyone's sort of clear on what we're talking about. So the first is we're talking about native trees. So these are basically trees that have been present in Scotland thanks to natural evolution. They haven't been introduced by people. That's a sort of very basic understanding of what we mean when we're using the word native. The next term that we use quite a lot is local provenance, and that's basically refers to trees that are collected in your local area. So that's of local provenance. There is a third term, we're not going to use it that much today, but it's worth being aware of. And this is local origin. And that means that trees are locally genetic, they've been there for a while. So something can be of local provenance, i.e. growing locally, but it may have a different origin, for example. So one thing to be aware of when you start collecting trees is to see if you can find out whether something is local provenance or local origin, because it can make a difference. Something to be aware of as well when you're collecting around estates, for example, that have a lot of planted trees. They might be quite old, but they might not be of local origin, for example. Same with local authority parks, for example, in urban areas where a lot of trees are planted that are definitely not of local origin. And there's, the chances of having non-wild varietals are quite high. So why are we focusing on native local provenance trees? Quite a number of reasons, especially in light of sort of climate change and adaptation that we need to consider. Local provenance is a much better match to sort of local conditions. When you look at this picture here, this is a really good example of some holly growing at quite a high altitude and probably a latitude as well. So this will have been used to the local conditions, local growing conditions in that area. If we were, for example, to plant holly that came from down south, it probably wouldn't do quite as well because it's used to different conditions. It's really important as well that we conserve local genetic diversity for species as well as the wildlife that's associated with it, and make sure that we're continuing the sort of genetic adaptation to local conditions. And with that, we're also maximizing outcomes for trees to withstand the challenges of exposure and local weather, in addition to the local soil conditions. And you know, these may have translated into locally adapted features, so, you know, longer thorns, for example. It also means that we're minimizing biosecurity risks by transporting trees. If we can collect and grow and plant locally, we're really minimizing the threat of spreading disease and pests and pathogens, which is an issue that we must be aware of. In addition to that, we can also reduce costs, potentially, definitely with regards to transportation costs. We have a shortage of trees at the moment compared to the demand for tree planting, and quite often trees are coming from quite a distance, you know, for example, from a lot of nurseries down south, which is less than ideal. So the whole of the UK is broken into seed zones, so regions of provenance and seed zones, and this is a map of the Scottish section of it. And essentially they sort of, there's a north, well, there's an east-west divide, as you can see, and then there's further subdivisions north to south. These are somewhat arbitrary lines and somewhat not. Forestry Commission have more detail on this. If you Google Forestry Commission seed zone maps, you'll get a whole report on this. But it's worth being aware of what the different seed zones are, because again, they do refer quite often to the sort of conditions, the growing conditions that that are shared throughout the individual seed zones. So where possible, it would be great to sort of maximize planting from within the same seed zone, as was collected from. So when we're thinking about starting up a tree nursery, it really depends on two things. One is the resource that you have available, and the other is dependent on the outcomes that we want to achieve. So again, between the three of us that are presenting today, we started off with different resources and we're doing this for different outcomes. And the same will be the same case for yourselves. It can be something that you do as a hobby in your back garden, or it could be something that you want to do on a more commercial scale, and everything in between. One of the challenges of starting up a tree nursery at the moment is it is infrastructure heavy up front, and that has associated costs with it. So it very much depends on the sort of resources you do have to work with, until you manage to grow enough trees, you know, if you're running as a business, to make it a viable business, for example. So you're going to have to assess this yourself, and we're going to walk through the basics of this, which will help you determine what you can, you know, what is feasible in your context, in your scale. So the basics is, we're going to cover what, how, where, who, covered the why. So when we're looking at what, you really want to know what you want to be growing. The three nurseries that are presenting here, we are focused on native trees only. There are other nurseries that grow what we would consider non-native trees as well. So it depends on what you choose to do, and also what seed source you have available, whether that is locally around you or whether you're willing to travel a little bit for this. That's very much something that you'll need to determine in advance, and know where you can obtain your seed from. The other question with regards to your seed source is whether you want to collect it yourself or whether or not you'd like to buy it in. It is possible to buy seed to grow on, but it will very much depend on how you want to approach this, and this will be tied to other resource questions as well. You want to know how you want to grow your trees, so we're going to cover the two main ways of growing it, which is bare root or cell grown. That will come a few slides later. And again, both of those options have different implications for resourcing and time, which we'll cover shortly. The where is very much about literally where you're going to be growing, where your nursery is, and the features that it has. Do you have fencing to keep out deer, rabbits, hare, people? Do you have access to water, which is very important? Do you need access to power? And if so, do you have that? Do you have a sufficient growing area? Or do you know how much space you have to grow in? Or conversely, do you know how much you want to grow? And thus, from that, can you determine how big your growing area needs to be? Within that, do you also have an allocated work area? Do you have space? If you're going to be working on your own, that can be quite small. If you're going to be working with volunteers, you might need a little bit more. The other question, which is tied to whether you're bare root or cell grown, is also whether or not you need compost. So if you're cell grown, you're going to have to buy in compost. So being able to have access for that to be delivered, for example, or stored as well, is of consideration. One of the next things to consider is stratification, and we're going to cover this later on. So stratification is basically subjecting seed to a period of cold before they're able to germinate. And so depending on the species that you collect, some of them will need stratification and thus storage. And also other seed that doesn't need stratified but needs to be stored over the winter before sowing will require space of some sort, whether that is a small fridge or something else. It depends again on your approach, and we'll cover that later too. There's considerations as well for quarantine areas. So some nurseries will buy in plant plugs, so small plugs that they'll then grow on in the nursery to sell on, or they'll buy in seed, or they'll trade with other nurseries. So when you're doing something like that and you're bringing in external plant material, it's a good idea to have a designated quarantine area where they can be for a couple of weeks. Again, to make sure that you're not bringing any sort of biosecurity hazards into your nursery. The who section, again, is going to depend on the scale of sort of the involvement of people in your nursery, whether it's just yourself or whether there's a small group of people within the community or whether there are volunteer groups going in. You need to make sure that, depending on that, you have the facilities in place. So at the very basic, it would be great to have some sort of toilet, whether it's like a compost toilet or something else. The other tea and coffee facilities are great as well. Some kind of shelter is really good. And also whether or not you need an office. Do you want an office on site, or do you want to do that from home, or is there another option for that? Okay, so we've answered most of the other questions about why and when and where, etc. And now we're on to when. So running a tree nursery is very, very tied to the seasons, and it has really nice cycles within it that, well, I think they're nice. I quite enjoy them. And you can largely sort of group them into collecting, processing, selling, growing. I've put in working with people and other, because again, depending on the setup of your nursery, you might have other things that are part of that seasonality. But the four basic ones, collecting, processing, selling, and growing, are sort of the main components of that. The majority of your collection will take place in late autumn, early winter. There are some species where seed is produced in late spring, early summer, but the majority is in the sort of months that have just passed. Depending on the year, it can start in late August, usually sort of September, October, November. You then have to process the seed that you collect, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And that can take place over the sort of late autumn and winter. Your selling period is primarily in the winter as well, because that's tied with the main planting season for trees, which is over the winter, when the trees themselves aren't sending energy into the leaves. Energy is dormant in the root systems, and so that's when most trees are planted to sort of maximize viability. When spring comes, the sap rises, they start to grow, they are already in situ, and the roots have settled within the soil there. And then from sort of late winter, early spring, we start with sowing and growing. And that runs right through to the autumn as well. So it's worth having a sort of idea of the seasonality of these and how you plan your work through the year and how you plan your resourcing as well. I'm going to run through the what, basically. So the main seed types. So there's about 5. The first classification is nuts. So in Scotland, in our native trees, that's basically hazel and oak. They're quite straightforward. You can see oak on the left, and essentially what we're looking for with oak is to collect them usually from about mid-October onwards. And in this example here with cell-grown oak, we've got acorns that have produced a radicle, the little germination bit that's sticking out of the acorn. We're looking to pop those up into cells because we know that they've kickstarted germination. They'll go into a cell pretty much as soon as that radical has appeared, where that will continue to grow through the winter before going dormant. And then the actual sapling will start to grow in early spring and emerge from the cell. We've got hazel on the right. So hazel is slightly different. We also look to plant a radical, but we don't do that until the spring. So over the winter, we essentially mix hazelnuts in a mixture, usually of compost and sand or something similar, put them in a container of some kind, and leave them over winter, during which time they'll start producing radicals. And then in early spring, you can go and look for those that have produced them, pot them up either into a seed bed or into trays as well. The next category we have are berries and fleshy fruits. So there's quite a few of those in Scotland. So it's the likes of rowan, hawthorn, blackthorn, elder, dog rose, holly, yew, cherries, and crabapple. These are the ones that need the most processing. They're the most fiddly and time consuming. They need processing largely because the fleshy bits of the berries have a germinating inhibitor, for a compound that inhibits germination, essentially. So we need to separate the seed from the flesh as much as possible. Depending on the volume of seed collected, it will depend how clean you get your seed, how much work you want to put into it, whether you're doing it by hand or you have other methods of doing it. It will very much depend on the size of your enterprise and the manpower that you've got available. But the idea is that we do have to separate the seed from the flesh enough so that the seed can germinate. Now, most, but not all, most of the buried seed needs 2 winters of what we call stratifications. Stratification just basically means it goes through a period of cold. So hawthorn, for example, needs 2 winters. So that means when we collect it, say in September, October, we try and remove as much of the flesh from the seed as possible, tend to mix that again in a mixture of compost and sand, or if the seed is clean and dry enough, that can just go into a refrigerator for artificial cold storage, stratification, and that will be in there until we sow the seeds in spring 2025. Okay, so some of the seed that we're collecting now, we're not sowing until 18 months from now. There's other seeds. So for example, holly might need an extra year, and some might need a little bit less. So I've planted up elder seed that only had 1 winter of stratification. And it's something that you'll get used to doing. You know, you get a feel for the different needs of the berries and the different seeds that you're planting and working with. So the third category are what we call the winged seeds. These include wych elm, ash, and field maple, and these tend to be the ones that are collected in sort of late spring, early summer. So this is a photograph of wych elm, for example. It's the browny disc bits that contain the seed. And again, these are collected and sown in a seed bed usually. But again, when you're thinking about your timings and your resourcing, be aware of what you'll need if you want to propagate these trees that set seed at this time of year. Make sure you've got time set aside for that, because it can quite often compete with a really busy season when you're growing trees as well. The fourth category is roughly the cones category. Within that, we've got Scots pine, common alder, we've got the birches and juniper as well. Juniper is often called a berry, but technically speaking, it is a cone. Cones, essentially, they're quite straightforward, I think. They get collected, dried out, and then the seed is dispersed from the cone itself. Again, most of these are in the autumn. Scots pine tends to be collected sort of February, March, dried out fairly quickly, and then the seed sown in late spring, early summer. So the photographs have got running along the top of down birch, and bottom left we've got alder cones that are quite dry on the tree as well, and bottom right is a Scots pine sapling. These are just a series of pictures to show the process involved with alder seeds. So on the top left is a fresh alder cone. The middle top are dried alder cones that have opened up and released the seed, which are then sieved more finely in the top right. These are sown usually into a seed bed and start growing into little saplings in the bottom left and middle left, which are then, if you're cell grown, these are transplanted into a cell, or they stay in the seed bed. Again, depending on your setup. But these are the things to sort of be aware of when you're looking at the different sort of approaches to growing, how that sort of impacts how you process and where you plant, for example. Then the final category is with cuttings. And we typically propagate from cuttings for willows and for aspen. So with willows, willow will produce seed, and it will produce seed again sort of in the warmer months, but it's incredibly fine. I mean, it's like peppercorns, and there's a very, very short window of time before it's available and will blow away. So it can be tricky. It's not impossible, but it can be tricky. So willow can be propagated from cuttings, but the thing to bear in mind with cuttings is that these aren't genetically distinct from the parent tree. These are clones of the parent tree. So we're not maximizing genetic diversity here. But it is possible to take cuttings, grow them on, and perhaps have a seed source at your nursery, for example. The other tree we often take cuttings from is aspen. Aspen is a really important tree, but in Scotland it doesn't flower very often at all. And when I say it doesn't flower very often at all, often it can be 20 years in between flowering. So it's very hard to propagate from wild seed sources. So there are a few nurseries that have been growing from root cuttings. We don't tend to take tree cuttings. We take root cuttings from aspen, again in sort of late winter. And then these are potted up in the nursery setting itself. They send up shoots. Those shoots again are repotted. And you'll notice one technique, or one sort of tip that I didn't know when I started out, was that trees that are propagated from cuttings like to be planted at the edge of a pot, not in the middle, which is why you see it in a really nice circle in that image on the right hand side there. So something to bear in mind if you're propagating from cuttings. Now, in a nursery setting, you don't have to just grow trees. You can grow understory shrubs, you can grow wildflowers and other plants, you can diversify into fruit trees, or there'll be something entirely different. And this might be something to consider if you've got the space and you've got the capacity, you've got someone to sell to, if there's demand for it. Again, if you're looking to create a viable business, these are things to consider. I've put in other, and a photograph of me up a tree. This is a training that I managed to do earlier this year on tree climbing and aerial rescue, which means that I am certified to help collect, I can climb trees to collect Scots pine cones, for example, which will help other nurseries as well. So that's one way that I'm looking to diversify what I can do. It means that I can also climb trees for other conservation work, whether it's for raptor bringing or similar, bat surveys or something like that. So it's worth considering if this is something for you as well. So I spoke about growing in cells and bare root growing. So I'm going to have a quick give you a quick overview of growing in cells, and then Andy's going to talk about bare root growing. So in my nursery, I don't grow bare root, which is why Andy's going to offer his expertise. I grow only in cells. So there's pros and cons to each, and again, it's an assessment you're going to have to make. Cell grown means that trees are grown in individual cells, as you can see in the picture here. It means that when they're removed, they come with a plug of compost around them, which means that the window for when they can be planted is theoretically all year round, but it means that the window of time between them being lifted from a cell and actually going into a ground is a lot longer than a bare root. So bare root means there's no soil, the roots are bare, and so they're a lot more exposed. The amount of time they can stay that way is much, much shorter. So when you have projects working with volunteers where you're dependent on other people coming in to plant your trees, where things might get delayed because there's poor weather and the trees might not get in the ground when you think they might, then cell-grown trees are a good option because they have a bit of a longer shelf life, as it were, between lifting them from a nursery and putting them back in the ground at a planting site. It is a bit more of an infrastructure sort of, you have more infrastructure costs basically, because you have to buy seed trays and you also have to buy in compost, and that's an additional cost that not everybody wants to have, especially if you have good land available where you can plant bare root trees. I chose this because for me, I'm working with a lot more volunteers. It also means it's much easier for me to maintain an overview of how many trees I'm growing because it's much easier to count. It means I really liked the fact that there's a bigger window for the trees to survive once they leave the nursery and before they get planted. The things that are a bit more challenging is that you really have to stay on top of watering and making sure that plugs and the cells stay wet enough, particularly during drought season, which is only going to become much more of a challenge for us growers. So you do have to be more on the ball with that, because it can only take one day of really hot temperatures and no watering, and you might lose, an entire tray of young seedlings, particularly in small cells. So again, it just depends on the sort of resource you have available, whether you can be on site to water things every day, or whether you can put in automatic irrigation, etc., etc. This is what trees can look like once they are more fully grown in cells. Yeah, for me, it's just with the site that I have at my nursery, this was the right choice for me. I don't really have any suitable land for growing into, and I wanted the capacity to be able to count and maintain an overview of what I was growing, because for me, and I'll speak about this later on when I talk more about my nursery, my time was very limited. So I had to make choices that really worked for my context as well. Okay, so we'll move on to Andy, who's going to talk about bare root trees.
Hi there, thanks, Ilana. I'll just quickly say how I do a small number of hazel and oak at the croft at the nursery. Yeah, this is just to complement what I do. I do mainly cell-grown trees, but I've devised this method to grow hazel and oak in effectively what look like raised beds. That's 4.8 meters by 900 millimeters wide, with the boards dug in at the sides so the voles can't get in. And then once they're sown and covered, in the top right, that is hazel. Oh, sorry, top left is hazel, top middle is oak, and then that's the one on the right is the bed covered over. The oak is sown in the autumn, soon after they're collected, and the hazel is sown in the spring. But the hazel could effectively be sown in the autumn as well. They're then covered with vole-proof mesh, and just left to get on with it until the trees reach the mesh, and then I can take the mesh off. They're pretty safe from predation from rodents once they're sprouted and growing. The vulnerable time is over the winter, and in my experience, the voles, they can get in, especially if it's very frosty and the ground is heaved around the side and is softened around the side. So you need to be aware of that and make sure that the ground is well firmed around the side. And I do generally put a trap inside once the mesh is on top, just as a belt and braces measure. So if anything does get in, it reaches a point and eats a few acorns and then dies, but at least has a nice last meal. Anyway, you can go to the next slide now, Alana, please. So they grow in those boxes for a year, and then some of them will be big enough to be sold after the year. Most of them will be lined out for a second year, and I line them out with a plank, the picture there on the left. Pretty densely, I can get nearly 1,000 trees in a 16 by 4 foot bed. I line them out very close together with enough space in between the rows to get a hoe in between, so I can hoe them very quickly to keep the weeds down. And then once the leaves grow and the canopy is covered, the weeds are shaded out. I did try growing the oaks in a bed for 2 years, but of course they send down a very strong taproot, which makes them very difficult to dig up the next year. And you can try undercutting them with a sharp spade after the first year to cut the taproot. In a big commercial nursery, they'll have a tractor going along with a blade underneath, which will cut the taproots, so they can leave them in the beds for 2 growing seasons. But on the scale I was doing it at, it's easy just to dig them up and line them out for a second year's growth. And on the right, those are trees that are bundled up and then healed in until they're ready to be planted in the late autumn there, or probably in the late winter. And that's very briefly just how I do bare root trees. This is nothing like how they're grown in big commercial nurseries, but it works quite well for me. I can do it. I think I've done about 700 oak this year, and about the same in hazel bare root on top of the soul grown stuff. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thanks, Andy.
Okay.
Okay, so we've had a chat about the different types of seed you can collect and how you can grow them. I'm going to talk briefly about things to consider when you're collecting seed, if that's what you're choosing to do. One of the things that's important is to make sure you've got landowner permission. It's particularly when you are going at a commercial scale and you're intending to sell. This is something that you will need to make sure you've got in place, quite apart from the fact that it's good manners, I think, to do that. The next bit to consider is the timing of your collection. And this is something that every year that you grow, you'll get a better sense of when things become viable, when they start to ripen. In the last few years, there's been variations, even in that short amount of time. It'll become something that you have to observe and sort of get used to. The other thing that you'll start to learn is with individual species as well. So for example, with oak, there are years where you have mast years where they produce, that means they produce an abundance of seed, usually followed by a couple of years of very little seed. So it's not unusual for there to be a bit of a cycle like that. And then there's other nuances, which include, not collecting the first fall of acorns of the season, because those tend to be the weaker, more diseased, less viable seed, but waiting until sort of second fall to collect those, which tend to coincide with the sort of drop in temperatures, which kickstarts the germination of acorns. So things like that. But this is something that with practice and by doing, you'll learn. The other thing which we've already talked about is about provenance and origin, making sure that you're sort of doing your homework a little bit to try and find out, especially if you are close to urban areas, more built up areas or estates, that you can try and get as much information about where the trees came from originally or when they were planted. The other thing to make sure you're doing is that when you are collecting is try to collect from a number of trees within the same species. And we do that so that we can maximize the genetic diversity. So we're not just collecting from one tree, but we're collecting from multiple trees. And that also has a lower impact on each individual tree. You also want to have a look at how healthy the tree is. The healthier the tree, the more likely you want to collect from it. There are tree diseases out there that affect some of the species that we collect. So for example, rowan can suffer from something called fire blight. So where you see a rowan that has sort of blackened tips and just doesn't look healthy, don't collect from it. You're unlikely to have very good seed from that and potentially spreading the disease further. I've put something in here called fair share, and that's a policy that I adhere to in the sense that I don't ever strip a single tree of all its seed. I always just take what I need, but leave plenty for wildlife, because we have to remember we're not just dealing with climate change, we're also dealing with serious impacts for biodiversity. So we don't really want to be adding to the problem. So it only takes what's your fair share, basically, and spread the bounty with our fellow species. The next consideration is about biosecurity. So when you are collecting from multiple different woodlands, you are potentially spreading disease between them all on your boots and your feet. So it's worth investing in something to clean your boots in between visits. There are sprays that you can use that are biocides that will kill pathogens. So it's worth doing, particularly if you are going to access sensitive sites or triple SIs or things like that. But it's a good habit to get into anyway, something to be aware of. And finally, if you're looking to sell, you need to be registered with the Forest Reproductive Materials System that Forestry Scotland run. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well later on. So earlier on, we spoke in the different sort of seed types. We covered a little bit of the different processing and stratification methods. I put this in a category of its own because it does potentially take quite a lot of time, again, depending on how you want to approach it. But it's really useful to understand the different needs, becoming familiar with the different processing and stratification needs of the different types of tree species that you want to grow, and how that's going to work logistically with your collection, with storage, and also keeping track of what's what. So labeling is a big thing. One of my greatest days was when I bought my label maker, and I could actually make sense of what I had, because it was starting to get really confusing with different species collected from different sites. And then once I was into my second and third years, multiple years of growing, that became a lot more tricky to sort of keep a track of. So it's worth thinking about the sort of the logistics of all of this as well. So finally, when we get to grow at the growing stage from sort of late winter, early spring, again, the sort of sowing and growing needs for each species will be slightly different. They will have different needs and different preferences, different growth rates and different germination rates. So on average, for example, about 50% of your acorns will will germinate and turn into a sapling. And for other species, it's higher, for others it's lower, and that's an average. And again, this will be influenced by what the weather is doing that year, and potentially the viability of the actual seed that you've collected itself. Growing and propagation is very much dependent on sort of the elements as well. This year was quite a challenging one. We had lots of cold easterly winds to start off with. The temperatures didn't really get up during germination season early in the year, which was a challenge to start with. And then we had extremes in water and sun. And so we've got to work with these things. We've got to make sure that where there are effects, where there's not enough natural water, for example, that we're supplementing that with watering the trees ourselves, and also preventing things like windburn, but also the effects of high temperatures caused by sunny spells. You wanted to have determine how much space you have to grow in. Typically you want outside space, whether you're bare root or cell grown. Polytunnels are great to start things off with, but they get very hot very quickly, and they can kill stuff quite quickly as well. And trees don't actually like really hot spaces. So actually having a smaller polytunnel, but then a net shade tunnel might be a better option, for example. And again, it depends on how much you want to grow, either bare root or cell grown. Your growing will also depend on the time you've got available and how many people you have available to help you do it. If you're cell grown, you've got to factor in things like potting up, and that can take up a lot of time during the summer when trees are growing rapidly and they need to get into cells quite quickly. There's other tasks that need doing, such as weeding through the year. Depending on where you live, the weed pressure can be higher or lower. It really just depends. One thing to watch out for as well is the spread of disease in your trees. Making sure that you're keeping humidity levels fairly low. You're not importing things from outside, that you are removing any trees that you do see that are diseased, and that you're keeping a vigilant eye on that. And that really, again, is making yourself familiar with what is out there and what we need to keep an eye on. Andy's already touched upon protecting your trees. So the nut species in particular, acorns and hazel, are very valuable to rodents. So they need probably the most protection. But in most of Scotland, where geopressure is high, as well as rabbit and hare pressure potentially as well, we often need to protect trees from larger mammals, either through netting or fencing, rather. The final point to consider is the importance of air pruning. So air pruning is essentially, say you've got a pot with a tree in it, rather than have the pot sit on a surface where the roots will just continue to sort of grow underneath the pot, have the underneath of the pot sort of suspended, so there's air at the bottom of the pot. So when the roots come to the bottom of the pot, they actually stop when they hit the air, and then they grow out the way rather than down the way. And that helps them produce really big root systems and helps prevent them sending down that really big taproot into something you don't want it to go into. Quick note on compost, if that is something that you're going to be using. There is going to be legislation that all compost used in horticulture is peat-free. Peat is favoured by a lot of growers because of its moisture retaining properties. So there's a lot of experimenting with alternatives to peat and non-peat or peat-free composts. They do have different needs. It does mean adjusting watering systems in particular, but it's worth doing now. So if you can get peat-free compost, I highly recommend you do that. A lot of peat-free alternative composts have a lot of coir in them, which in my mind sort of just outsources the problem. Coir comes from the husks of coconut, and typically it comes from India and Sri Lanka and is shipped and treated here. And so whilst it has sort of similar properties to peat and in some senses, it's also not a sustainable option. And I know that there are big compost producers that are looking at creating both peat and coir-free mediums for growing in. If you are getting any sort of locally produced compost, let's say from municipal waste, which is possible, you want to make sure that they are heat treated so that they can kill any sort of parasites and other things that are in the compost that could hatch and eat your roots later on in the season. You also want to consider, depending on the sort of compost you have, whether or not it has fertilizers in it. So there's things like Osmocote that have a slow release fertilizer. It is chemical based, but it is slow release, which is useful when you're growing trees that are growing for a year or two. And the other thing is, you know, if you're not using something like that, what natural alternatives are there for feeding your trees through the year, giving them a boost? So looking at things like seaweed, comfrey, nettle. I know there's tree growers very successfully using urine, so there's all sorts of options out there. One of the other final considerations is the use of nematodes. So I use nematodes, for example, to prevent the larvae of vine weevils. I always want to say wine weevils. Yes. You can get nematodes that you can apply about twice a year. It's fairly cheap, but the nematodes are a natural sort of treatment for preventing the larvae of vine weevils, which will eat your roots. You won't really know it until you try and pull the tree out, because they'll eat the roots of your tree, and you really don't want that. It's not helpful. So then we come to selling. There's any sort of manner of selling, again, depending on your scale. You can have like an honesty box or directly on site. You can sell to your local crofters or farmers. You can grow to sell to specific projects. For example, Woodland Trust is a big one in Scotland. You can just do general sales. You can do online sales. It depends, again, how you want to set your nursery up and why you're growing trees and who for. One thing that is important to remember, and this is relevant as this next slide, is if you are selling trees, you have to register what you are producing under the FRM system. It's free to register. It's all online now. It is fairly straightforward, but essentially what this does is track what we call reproductive materials. So any sort of plant-based material, whether it's seed or whether it's actual trees that you want to grow in order to or sell, it has to be registered. And in part, that's in order to track and trace where things have come from source to sort of planting. There's plant passports as well. And again, it depends on sort of how much you grow and who you sell to. That's administered by SASA and the Scottish Government here. That does come with an annual fee. But again, that exists pretty much to be able to track and trace any sort of disease outbreaks. So if there are disease trees that are planted out, it can be traced back to the source nursery, and any other plantings elsewhere can be found and dealt with as well to limit the spread of diseases and pathogens. There's two voluntary standards as well. One is called the UK and Ireland Sourced and Grown Standard, which was devised by the Woodland Trust. It's free. It involves an annual audit, which is fairly painless. You can download the standards for free off the website and follow it, even if you don't want to get audited. I did that from the start because it gave me, at the time, there wasn't really anything else to give me any sort of indication as to the standard I was looking for in terms of running a nursery. So I just used that, and I would recommend that. Actually, it's straightforward and fairly easy and useful. There's also Plant Healthy, which again comes with a fee, but is a little bit more in depth, I think, than UK ISG. Okay, startup and operation costs. Just briefly going to go through costs of running a nursery and things to consider. These are potential costs. And again, it will depend on the scale of your particular nursery, what you want to consider, what will apply to you. So quite often, at the very basic level, we want to have an idea of what land we've got, what infrastructure we have and need. Do we need any vehicles or machinery? And what kind of growing materials do we need? So for example, if you're cell growing, the actual cells and the compost. Then there's the cost of water and or other utilities such as power, space for seed storage, any sort of equipment that you might need for collection or processing or growing. Then we've got the aforementioned sort of fertilizers or feeds and nematodes, and potentially seeds if you're buying seed in. And there might be staff and volunteer costs, depending. It might just be the cost of teas and milk, for example, and biscuits, or it might be more than that. In terms of admin costs, it's worth considering, you know, do you need any office space? Are there office costs that you need to cover? If you're going to have any sort of legal status, there will be costs associated with the incorporation of that. So between the three of us, we've got 3 different setups, and they have 3 different sort of costs associated with it. There's accountancy and tax return costs potentially, again, depending on your scale and whether or not you have the capacity and the scope to do that yourself. Insurance is another one. We've got the standards and registrations that I just covered. There's also costs potentially if you want to have a website. So the actual website hosting, if you want somebody to make your website or you do it yourself, there's free options out there, but the website hosting will be a cost, as will like sort of email addresses and stuff like that. And you might have marketing costs, you know, or not. You could do it for free on social media, or you could put something in the local paper. It all depends. But these are things to definitely sort of be aware of that might be relevant to how you want to do things. In terms of legal structures, there's a few different options here. You could be a sole trader. You could set up as a company limited by guarantee or other. You could set up as a charity or a social enterprise, or do something entirely different. And there's any number of examples that have set up using all of these methods here. No, we're not experts, but I'm hoping to get a workshop with a solicitor who runs her own sort of legal social enterprise to talk to tree nurseries about the options and hopefully have sort of one-to-one surgery. So watch this space. Okay, so we've got a list of resources here that would be useful for growing. One that came out this year is the Tree Growers Guide, which is absolutely phenomenal. It's really useful. The second that was my first go-to book was the Handbook of Scotland's Trees that Reforesting Scotland published, and there's a few others. Andy's going to talk about the Facebook group, yeah, there's plenty of other resources here as well to do with growing and running nurseries. The Harvesting and Processing Grant is one to look into potentially as well, and Andy will touch on that too. Okay, so that's sort of gone over time quite significantly in this first bit, but hopefully it was useful. But essentially, just to recap, you know, it will really, again, depend on the resources you've got available and what you want to do with the nursery or why you want to grow trees. That will dictate what your setup will look like and how you approach your growing. And there's any number of ways. There's no one right way of doing it. And there's tons of examples of small nurseries in Scotland. 3 of us are here, so we'll talk through that now. And I'm now going to hand over to Jacqui from Knoydart, who's going to talk about her nursery there.
Hi, well, thank you. I'm absolutely terrified, so bear with me, please. I started the Knoydart Nursery in 2021, based in Inverary in Knoydart, and it's a community interest company. And so last year was my first full grown season, so I'm new to all this. And last year went okay, which is quite good because the year before that I never knew a birch from an alder, so I've sort of got there. I'll show you my timeline, it's coming up next. So this runs through from when I decided that I was going to grow trees. I had been growing veg, but then I thought I'm going to try trees instead. So that's from winter, like October 2020, through the whole FRM registration, finding out about all the paperwork, plant passports, deciding to make it into a kick, became a kick, applying for the bank, doing a business plan, all that stuff, down to where I am at the moment, which is just about to, I'm expanding onto a bigger site to try and grow more trees to basically get more income, really. The plot I started off on was quite small. It was 16 metres by 30, so 480 square metres was what I had, or what I've still got. Which is fine, it was big enough for me. I had a tunnel on it anyway that was 14 foot by 50 foot. Right in the middle of it, 2 outside growing areas either side, and an area at the back, and a wee shed. So the Tasha, I was quite lucky, Tasha from Egg, when I decided that I was going to grow trees, I knew about the Egg Nursery, and contacted Tasha, and she was able to fill me in about all the FRM things to do that I had no idea about at all. So that was really good. It was all pretty straightforward and very quick and painless. Yeah, so that's all fine. It's easier than funding applications, I must say. What I grow here is, because I'm growing mainly for Knoydart Forest Trust, who they've been on Knoydart since 1999 and look after the community woodlands, and they grow for kind of neighbouring estates as well, plant. So they buy in and have bought in tens and hundreds of thousands of trees for the years. I've been here for 30 years, and you see all these bags of trees coming in every year. And so I sort of thought I would maybe just get in there with the Forest Trust and see if we could sort of reduce the amount being brought in a wee bit as well. So because I don't sort of grow tens of thousands of birch and alder or anything like that, because the Forest Trust are buying in so many that they can get them really, really cheaply from the big nurseries. So I'm sort of focusing on the local provenance, harder, the ones that they find harder to get, which are oak and hazel, so that's what I'm sort of hoping to do more of, which, well, this year was great for the last year with the oak. So I do grow birch and alder and rowan, and I'm trying holly and some bird cherry and hawthorn. And this year I've found some burnet rose, which was quite nice, and trying the dog rose and iris for someone else. Oh, and I've been sort of building up, I've been trying the aspen as well. So I've been doing aspen from root cuttings, and I've found like 8 or 9 different clones at the moment on Knoydart, and sort of got a few of them, a few of each grown. So I'm going to try and do more than that, but I'll need to speak to the FRM folk about that first and do whatever I need to do there. So I grow just using wee seed trays on hanging shelves, which you can see in that left-hand photo. That's just a shelf tied onto the poles to keep the mice away. I get absolutely inundated with voles, and I've killed thousands of things at the moment. So hanging shelves, mouse-proof tables for like the oak when I bring them in. I start the oak off in fish boxes because it's all of the beach is full of them. I'm right next to the water, so you can just go out and do a bit of beach clearing at the same time and gather up fish boxes. I put the oak in them, and for the first year, and then the second year, as Andy was saying, that's them lined out down the side of the tunnel for their second year, and they'll be getting taken out this winter and planted out on the hill. What else? So yeah, I mean, the fish boxes, they're fine, but it's not, you get fish box roots. I don't know what the technical term is, but they sort of go down and then they go right along the bottom of the fish box. So this year, because I've been applying for funding, I got money for the new nursery for sort of nursery equipment, and I bought myself some prop tech trays. So at the moment, they're actually full of, well, I've got over 16,000 acorns in the prop tech trays, which is fab. And down in on the right-hand photo at the bottom left-hand corner is some rowan that they're on the next picture actually, that were cell grown and didn't do very well. And the cells, they were last year, and I put them out too early because it was far too hot in the tunnel and my watering was rubbish. And I was using, oh, there they are. So that's the wee cells. This was January 23. So they've been growing all year. They weren't doing very much at all. I was using my own compost because it was all I had, which didn't help. And I thought, I don't really want to leave them in the cells for another year. So I stuck them in the ground, popped a hole, put them in, and they were fab, and they're really good. Some of them, I didn't actually intentionally, I don't know why they've grown like that. I didn't intentionally put in smaller to bigger, but that's just what they've done. And they're all going away this winter as well. So that's really good. What's next? Why I chose a kick. The nursery. So I wanted it to stay. I didn't, the nursery would become a community asset. I'd be able to apply for funding. It's a simple process. Becoming a kick. Mine is a kick with small membership. So I've only got 3 directors, and those directors are the members. It's a company limited by guarantee, and I started off with 2, and I was able to very simply add in a 3rd director because my Awards for All application wanted 3 directors. So I chose a kick because I was kind of hoping that the nursery, I mean, it was only the first year last year, and I was hoping that it would work, and it seemed to be going okay. And then I was thinking that it would be a bit of a shame, really, if it all worked, and, you know, and there was trees getting grown from seed collected on Knoydart, and they were getting grown on Knoydart, and then they're getting planted back out again on Knoydart. And it would be a bit of a shame if in a few years' time I was like, right, I've had it. I'm too old, my back's sore, my hips are sore. I'm going to pack it all in. So I thought that turning it into a kick, then at least whenever I packed it in, I knew that it would continue if it was anything worth continuing. And the other reason, to be honest, was because I wanted to apply for funding, because I had been spending like so much money on it. It was an expensive hobby. I was still working at the time, and I was going to the nursery in the morning, then going to work, then back to the nursery after work, and at the nursery all weekend. So to be able to sell enough trees to pay a wage, I needed to grow a lot more trees, and I needed a lot more space. And that's what I've been doing this year, is applying for funding. Because I was a kick, I was able to apply for the funding, get a bigger bit of ground, and at the moment I'm just sort of in the process of getting the ground all cleared and stuff, but I've sort of waffled on there. So I don't even know where I am. Kick, yeah, I think that's about all about the kick, really. It was the easiest thing for me to do. There's a lot of kicks on Knoydart, so I'm quite used to them, and they're a good community company, and I suppose it all depends what you want to do with it at the end up, but I know that mine will just continue. Yeah. So it's where do my trees go? Knoydart Forest Trust, as I said, I'm in the kind of fortunate position that the Forest Trust directors all agreed in 2021 that if I set the nursery up, that they would buy all suitable trees that I had. They've got to be suitable, obviously. So I'll never be able to grow all that the Forest Trust want. So they'll buy the cheaper ones. They buy all their birch and all their alder from all the big nurseries. It's far cheaper than I would be able to sell them at. And because they're sort of saving some money on the big 80,000 birch and things like that, they can kind of justify spending a wee bit more on my oak or hazel or whatever it is that I'm selling them. Yeah, I've sold these. Well, I actually packed my job in. The job that I'd had for like 30 years, I packed it in March this year so I could spend more time at the nursery to get the whole thing up and running. And the trees in the right-hand picture are being bought by my ex-boss, so that was quite nice. That's the van was last year's. That was my first ever trees going out last November to the Forest Trust, planted on Knoydart. I hope I'm sort of making sense here because I'm waffling on. Challenges, voles are my big challenge. Voles, mice. My watering's not very good. I'm all cell really, apart from the oak. The voles, these two pictures were about a month ago, and the cells on the right hand picture are what was left of 200 hawthorn that somebody had ordered, and I think there's about 6 left, and they just completely demolished them overnight. They didn't even eat them, they just kind of chopped them off and dug into the compost. I'm not quite sure why. And the picture on the left, they did the same with the rowan, and those rowan were, I mean, they were like, you know, they were like 25 centimetres, some of them 30 centimetres, and they just pretended that they were wee beavers and just chopped them off and left them lying. Challenges, what else? Keeping seedlings alive after pricking out. My last year, I think I killed about 3,000 birch before I got it right. I was doing them when they were too small and I wasn't shading them and things like that. So I went on to Andy's websites. Andy's Facebook page is fantastic. And I wish there had been something like that, or I wish I'd found it earlier than I did. But I went on to there and I got advice and I took it, and my birch all survived. So I think you've just got to make sure that you ask for advice and you take it as well. Not enough shade, too much heat, polytunnel, 50 degrees during the summer. The tunnel that I've got in that garden gets the sun from 7:30 in the morning until it goes down at night. So, and there is absolutely no shade. It's drastic, really. You can't trying to do any pricking out, putting on, whatever you call it, outside and wee bits of shade that you can find with the midges. Not, yeah. other challenges, finding information. When I was starting out, I looked everywhere for things. I wish there was something like this, because I couldn't find anything at all. And yeah, costs were mentioned. Well, I was lucky. I mean, I already had the plot of land that we plot here, which was the 480 square meters. I had it because I was growing veg and salad for a few years on it. So I had the tunnel as well, which I think was about £1,700. I need to read my notes for this. I had a lot of tools and equipment because I had been doing it for a few years as well. So when I did decide, I bought these containers, these 40 cell trays. I bought them from Containerwise, and to get the price down to about £4 a tray, I had to buy a pallet of them, which was 680 trays, which is like 27,000 cells. I've still got boxes of them unused. At the moment, they were £2,700, so that's about 10 pence. 10 pence a cell. They're supposed to last about 10 years, so it's a penny a year really per tree you could look at. I bought seed trays, ground cover, fleece irrigation kit, more wheelbarrows. And I think that over 2021, when I started, I probably spent about £4,000. I mean, mainly on those cells, I must admit. So I spent about £4,000. I had the tunnel, £5,000, maybe something like that. I was using, I just used anything that I could find. I used crates, I used mushroom boxes, and I lined them with cardboard. Anything really. I did it as cheaply as I could, because at the time it was more of a kind of pilot project that I started off doing, I suppose. And it was all my own money, so I wasn't really splashing out. Setting up the new nursery that I'm doing at the moment, I'm applying for as much funding as I can. So setting up the new nursery, it's much bigger. It's 3,000 square meters, which is fab, but it was just covered in brambles and things like that. So there's been site clearance, leveling the ground because it was all over the place, making an access track, installing services. I'm going to put in a temporary water supply shortly because my tunnel is arriving next week actually, and I've got no water. The first year of setting up the new nursery is about 26,000, but 13 of that is the tunnel and the extra costs to get folk to Knoydart, because you've got to pay for the boats and accommodation for them and everything, and that adds on about another £2,000 or something. And 4.5 of the 26 is I've applied for money to see if I can get an electricity connection to the site. And if I don't get funding for it, I'll not be doing it, I don't think, because it's going to cost, well, it's going to cost about 3,500 to get the electricity to the site, and then it's the electricity, like the kind of final electricity supply from the electrician as well. I got 17,500 in funding. I got 10,000 from the Pebble Trust, they were really good, and I got 7,500 from Awards for All. I did ask for 10, got 7.5. So the 17.5 is taking me from a bramble bumpy site down to what I've got at the moment, which is an access track, areas levelled off for the tunnel, and I'm going to take I'm going to take the tunnel I've got down there at some point. And all the membrane and everything like that. So that could, if I don't get any more funding, I could move on with that at the moment. But I'm applying for more funding just now for next year, because I'm hoping to get staff costs of some sort or something like that, because as I said, I did pack in my job. I've got 2 very, very, very small part-time jobs at the moment, but it's not really enough, and it would be quite nice to be able to get some money for doing what I'm doing. And my last wee thing is that I actually find it really quite annoying that the billionaire landowner next door to me here that's buying my trees can get bleeding grant money to plant the trees that I've been growing for nothing, and I've cost a fortune. I think that's me. I probably went off on a tangent because I didn't really read all my notes that I was going to use.
Thanks,
So
Jacqui.
yeah,
That was really helpful.
I don't know if that was any use or not.
It was. Thanks, Jacqui. Okay, Andy, you're up next. We've got about 11 minutes left.
11. Okay, great. I'll rattle through it as quick as I can. Thanks very much, Jacqui. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're fine.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Jacqui. I think you've touched on some good points there, which I'd like to discuss at length. But yeah, especially about funding and all that kind of stuff. But I'm just going to show you what I've been doing on Mull for the last few years. Woodland Crofter, trees and shrubs, Isle of Mull. The first slide is the croft 10 years ago, which was just a big pile of brash and tree stumps. It's a community-owned woodland croft, one of 10 woodland crofts in northwest Mull. Yeah, and I decided a few years ago to start growing trees to make some money, to get some income at least for the croft. Next slide, please, Alana. That's the same view a couple of years ago now. We've moved on a bit from that, but that's the first polytunnel up and the garden and sheds and caravans and everything. I've been growing trees, collecting seed and growing trees on Mull for over 25 years on a very small scale, really, for most of that time. But when I got the croft, I thought it was a good opportunity to make a business of it. They say if you want to be happy, you should do what you love, try and make it a business out of what you love, which I think is great in theory. And I'm questioning that a little now as the years go by, and I realize that there's not a lot of money to be made growing trees on the scale that I'm doing it. I'm sort of topping out at a capacity of probably about 35,000, maybe 40,000 cell-grown trees maximum with the space I've got, doing everything myself, collecting all the seed, processing it, sowing it, pricking it out, potting it on, packing them up. To do that alone, to try and make a business out of it in this kind of intermediate small scale, it is very, very tricky. So I'm looking at other models, basically, as Jacqui has discussed, community interest companies or social enterprises, to try and make it work for me a bit better long term. Next, please, Alana. That's an aerial view taken this summer. A friend of mine's got a really good drone, and she comes every couple of years and takes some nice drone photos. That was probably late August. You can see there the 2 tunnels. I've got lots of trees hardening off there. The nursery is developed kind of in an ad hoc way without any real planning. The stumps got pulled out about 5 or 6 years ago to make some space, and then I created a garden and put the tunnel up, and then cleared some more stumps, and I've just kind of spread out as I've had the space without a clear plan. And I'm looking at that now thinking, right, I need to move fences and make a consolidated hardening off area to make watering easier and make my time work better, if you like. I don't want to spend that extra 20 minutes a day walking around with a hose. It's already an hour and a half watering in the summer, doing everything by hand. So I need to consolidate things and move things around. And these drone shots are great for planning. Yeah, next, please, Alana. That's just a nice another view from a different angle. Next. And another drone shot. You can see I've got a nice view looking north towards Rum, Skye, the Egg, and Ardnamurchan Lighthouse. Yeah, next, please. So my timeline, I started really in 2020, but of course the pandemic slowed everything down, and I didn't get the polytunnel up until 2021. Production was pretty small in the first year. I had about 5,000 trees to sell and a few bare root trees. 2022, I thought, right, let's go for it and expand, get a second polytunnel and loads more growing cells. So I applied for the Scottish Forestry Harvesting and Processing Options Grant, which covers everything forestry, really, from harvesting timber and all the machinery that goes with that to small nurseries. If you look at the guidance online, it's actually quite daunting, but there is money available for small nurseries if you can demonstrate that you're increasing your capacity by, I think it's 30,000 trees. So because I was already only very small, I was easily going to increase my capacity by that. So I applied for 7 different items. It was quite a complicated application. I had to get 21 quotes, 3 quotes for each item, and it totaled about 7,200. And I got nearly 3,000 back once all the bills were in, and I can put the application in. So I applied spring 2022 and got the payments spring this year after all the bills were paid. It's a retrospective grant, so you don't get the money till you've spent it, which is not great for some people if you haven't already got the money to put in. So in total, it's hard to know how much I've spent. Going to be about 12 grand into it now, I think, including the grant money. And that's just for the basics. It's completely off grid, so I applied for a solar power system, just a 700-watt system, which does me for water pumps and lighting and anything else I need for the nursery at the moment, but I probably will think about increasing that as I scale up. 2023, the second polytunnel went up. The first polytunnel's primarily for growing, for the root trainers, for growing trees, and the second one is for a workspace, for propagation space, for storage. So of course, as soon as I put that up, I just fill it up with junk. I've got probably 30,000 cells in production this year, which translated to actually 16,000 trees for sale, plus another 1,500 bare roots. So even if you've got 30,000 root trainers, you're not going to have 30,000 trees to sell every year, if that makes sense. You need, you're growing a lot more trees than you are actually selling, because you're keeping a lot of stock for a second year growing. And as Jacqui was saying, she was lining out trees that had done a year in the growing cells in a hybrid system, so you can take the smaller stuff and line it out in the nursery. That works quite well, and then you're freeing up those growing cells to prick out stuff into for the second growing year. But of course you have to have the space to do that, the ground to plant them in. So the aims for next year, which is approaching faster than I would have liked. I think it's December in a couple of days, or is it December tomorrow? I don't know. Too soon anyway. So the winter's going to go very quickly, and I've got loads of stuff to do at the nursery. Thankfully, the weather's been pretty good the last week or so. We've had some lovely cold, clear days for getting some stuff done, but of course it's dark at 4:30 if you're lucky. So yeah, the time in the winter goes pretty quick. I'd like to employ somebody at least for some of the time pricking out late spring, which is one of the busiest times for me. How that's going to work, I don't know. We'll see how the money goes, but even if I could just employ somebody for 1 day a week for a couple of months, that would be great. And then just have somebody to talk to as well, so I'm not talking to the radio. And I've put as the last thing, take a break. That's a note to myself, really. It's easy to become completely absorbed in, a lot of you will know this, Jacqui will know this, and Alana will know this. If you've got another job, then yeah, it's hard to find any time at all to do anything social. If you're trying to collect seed and prick out trees and everything's so time dependent, you know, you've got seeds germinating left, right and center, and seed trays drying out, and things that need to be watered, and you're running around, and yeah, the time just disappears. Anyway, next slide. Thank you. That's just a quick view of the garden with the bare root trees, which I am growing in a very loose rotation with vegetables. That works pretty well. Next. Yeah, that's just another view of some oak and hazel in the beds, which is sort of 16 by 4 foot beds. Next. That's me in the polytunnel with my hands in my pockets. Shade netting, I didn't realize quite how important shade netting was the first year, and I lost a lot of stuff just from getting completely scorched, because I wasn't used to growing trees in polytunnels. I think Jacqui touched on this. It gets very hot in a polytunnel on a hot day, and little seedlings just fry. Next. Yeah, that's the tunnel. That would have been last year, I think, early summer last year, and very satisfying to see it just filling up with root trainers. Next. These are my vole-proof boxes, like the boxes I had in the garden earlier for oak and hazel, but these are raised up off the ground. So effectively what I do is I pot up acorns in the autumn, and I put them into these 16 by 900 vole-proof boxes, which take about 1,600 cells each, and then they get covered over with vole-proof mesh and left all winter, and they stay outside all year. And yeah, they're vole-proof and they're brilliant. They don't cost too much to make, and essential, I think, if you're trying to grow oak in this part of the world. Next. And that's the hardening off area last year, before the second polytunnel went up. Next. Bag compost, just briefly. Yeah, the Sinclair compost I get in these 2 cubic meter bags, they're about I don't know how much they are now, 200 odd quid each, but that price doubles for me to get it to Mull, and Jacqui will know what it's like living on Knoydart as well, getting anything to the islands or Knoydart, which is effectively an island, isn't it? It's just horrendously expensive. So that's costing me the best part of 500 quid for what is, it says 2 cubic meters, but in practice it's about 1,600 liters. I'll probably get through, I've had 2 of those this year, and I'll probably get through 3 of those next year. So I'm talking about 1,500 quid for compost, which is probably my biggest fixed cost. Yeah, next. Water pump. The water is pumped up from the burn below the croft, and that is a solar panel, 120 watt solar panel, connected directly to a 12-volt solar pump, without any charge controller and any battery at all. So the more the sun shines, the more it pumps up the hill, which works out pretty well, because the more the sun shines, the more water I need. Next, I've got about 7,000 litres of storage. This summer I was getting through about 1,000 litres a day watering. So yeah, don't underestimate how much water you're going to need for cell-grown trees. They are very, very thirsty, especially if you're growing them for a second year when they are a lot bigger with a lot more leaf and there's a lot more transpiration. You can literally watch them wilt. In the hot spell this summer, I was watering them twice a day and getting through 1,000 litres a day. Next. So where do my trees go? Well, they grow on the croft, but they go to 3 community woodland projects on Mull, who are planting tens of thousands of trees every year. So I'm very lucky to have them as a captive market. I'm actually going to be hitting my maximum production in the next couple of years as they are tailing off with their restocking, unfortunately. So I'm already looking for other markets. I sell a few thousand a year to crofters, farmers, and smaller operations, smaller schemes, doing woodland grant schemes, that kind of thing. But the bulk goes to the community woodland projects. Yeah, next, please. Scottish Small Tree Nursery Network I set up on Facebook last year, mainly to answer my own questions, because I had so many questions about growing trees, and I was contacting the few people I knew who were very helpful, but I just thought that this was missing. There were so many people starting up nurseries, so many people interested in growing trees on various scales, and this has been a great resource for me and for lots of other people. So if you're not already a member, please feel free to join and ask questions and give advice, and yeah, join the group. That would be great. Next, please. And that's my Woodland Crofter Facebook page, where you can see what's going on the croft. And that might be the last one, is it, Alana? Next. No, back to you. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andy. I realise we are now nearly 5 minutes over time. I will razz through my bit, and then if everyone's okay to stay till 1:45 or something like that, we can answer any questions that are here. So I run Darroch Nurseries. My nursery specialises in native local provenance trees. I only supply to Scotland, and I only do cell-grown trees. I started growing with some sort of seriousness in 2021 as a pilot, really getting used to the characteristics of different seeds and what they needed, and then sort of made the decision to expand that and have it less of an expensive hobby and turn it more into a part-time job eventually. So I currently rent a piece of land about 10 minutes from where I live. It came with a polytunnel, so my costs were quite low. The landlords are really supportive of the project, largely because I'm set up as a social enterprise. So my nursery is run as a company limited by guarantee, but we have social enterprise clauses in our articles of association. So that means that we are not a profit making, I can't take home any bonuses or anything like that. All the profits are reinvested back into the business. And we have very clear social as well as environmental outcomes. That allowed me to apply for funding from the Social Entrepreneurs Fund. So I first got startup funding, which allowed me to purchase compost, seed trays, and pay for my insurance in the first year of growing. I've since been awarded sort of second phase of sort of the next step of funding that they offer, called the Build It Award, which will pay my part-time salary costs for a year, which is an absolute game changer, which means I can spend more paid time in the nursery growing more, effectively doubling what I grow between now and next year. So this year we produced about 8,500 trees, and aiming to double that for next year. So these photos are just some before and after shots of the polytunnel and outside space since we moved to the current site in December last year. So actually, literally just a year ago, actually. This is the difference on site. As I say, I'm a social enterprise, so I work very closely with people. I've worked with the local Woodland Trust and their Woodland Working Group volunteers. So they've been involved with collecting seed locally, growing it on locally, and we've just planted out the first trees from that project, which is fantastic. I also work with local mental health organisations, with groups supporting people suffering from social isolation and loneliness, particularly from sort of adverse life events. And we've been out seed collecting, planting, talking about trees, identifying trees and stuff like that, which has been great fun, and I highly recommend it. They're a fabulous bunch of people. And I really love this part of my work, as well as the growing side of things. And it's really great when, you know, we've been out, we've been identifying trees, and then the next time I see them, they say, I've been seeing rowan everywhere now that I know what it looks like. And it's so good to see and to experience that. Challenges for me were the setup costs. Again, I was quite lucky with the site that I've got now. The landlords are really supportive. They've been involved in social enterprises before, so they're really behind the ethos of what the nursery is set up to do. So I've got a nominal rent of £1 a year, and I've got that existing polytunnel to use as well, which is just really significantly reduced my costs. They're happy. You know, they said that they would carry the utility costs for water and any electricity, which at the moment is a godsend. Without that, quite frankly, I don't think the nursery would have really gone anywhere. So the sort of capital costs, startup costs were sort of the biggest challenge for me. The other sort of challenges were, as has been mentioned before, heat. And I think this is just going to be something with the sort of increase in extremes in weather, something that we'll have to really be a lot more cognizant of. And I'm actually, with the current site that I've got and the expansion, I think that's the next picture there, that current polytunnel, because it's at sort of quite old and at the end of its lifespan anyway, it's going to be replaced with net covering, so it'll become a net tunnel, which will offer a lot more airflow and shade. It's quite clay soil as well, so I'm a bit concerned about disease and stuff. And then the space next to it, which is currently quite vegetated, that's being cleared as we speak, and I'm applying for funding for a second larger polytunnel to accommodate not just the trees but also the volunteers, because we maxed out the current polytunnel immediately this year. It's just not big enough for what we were producing, which is, I guess, a good problem to have. But all right, so I think that's me. Okay, I will stop sharing now, and let's take some questions if there are questions. There is a sort of, under reactions, there's a raise hand thing, I think, which will help me figure out who wants to ask a question. Or stick it in the chat, but please ask any questions. We'll go from there. Otherwise, we'll stop. But before any of that, just a massive thank you to Jacqui and Andy for taking the time to contribute their knowledge and skills, because they really know what they're doing, and it's great to hear from different contexts, and also that we're all learning still. Lorraine.
Hi, yes, can you tell me, do you absolutely need a polytunnel, or are you just using the polytunnels really as shelter for yourselves, or, you know, can you just shove them all out in the ground, because that's where they've got to grow eventually, I guess?
Good question. I mean, in my first year of growing, I didn't have a polytunnel, but I did have a lean-to greenhouse, which helped me kickstart things off, and then they just went out as soon as something appeared, really, and that seemed to be okay. Andy, do you have any other experience on that?
Yeah, I'd say you absolutely don't need a polytunnel. I grew trees for years and years and years just in fish boxes and pots and, you know, whatever I could, and in the ground without a polytunnel. And in fact, using the polytunnel for cell-grown trees, they're not in the polytunnel for that long, you know, only for a few months. I mean, some people would say that you grow better trees growing them outside in the open environment. You grow hardier trees. I sometimes find that stuff grows too quickly in the polytunnel, but it's, you know, you get very sappy, soft growth. But it's a fantastic resource to have if you've got it, for working inside and for starting stuff earlier and extending your growing season. And But no, go for it without the polytunnel. It's a huge expense, and I'm constantly terrified it's going to blow away in a gale, and and destroy everything. Every time the wind is above 20 miles an hour, I get twitchy.
No, thank you. Very grateful for that. We do have a polytunnel. It's just that it's mostly taken up with veg. So yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
There's a question in the chat about the size of trays, cell trays that are being used. So I think all three of us are currently using trays, cell trays made by a company called PropTech, and they're quite interesting because they're the only ones that we know of that have sort of legs on them. They can be stacked neatly or twisted around and stacked with a gap, but they've got that sort of inbuilt air pruning system in them, and they're quite they're made from recycled plastic, but they're quite hardy. And so far I've really enjoyed growing in them. I get really, really nice root structures from the trees that I'm growing. But in terms of sizes, tend to use larger cells for bigger seed like oak and hazel, or anything that might be in there for a couple of years. So some alders, for example, I grew in there to grow to bigger sizes. So, but yeah, you can use what you have, really. Nicola, you've got a question about where to find funding bodies. I think it'll depend on sort of what you do and why. So for me, because I set up a social enterprise, I went through social enterprise funding. First Port was really helpful in terms of chatting about business setup, but also the sort of funding available. I did speak with the local business gateway folk here so I'm located in central Scotland. They were helpful to a point, but it was definitely First Port that helped me the most with that. The Pebble Trust is quite good for if you're Highlands and Islands based. And there'll be any number of other ones. There might be some lottery funding that's available depending on where you're located, what you want to do and your size. There's a harvesting and processing grant that Andy mentioned as well, but you do need to have match funding and be aware that you have to have the cash flow. You need to pay for everything before you get any money back, and the timescales of that aren't ideal either. So it really depends on what you want to do and what you come across. Labeling protocols. We get trees to our nursery from dispersed growers and are using species, grower initial, date and postcode. Is that enough? Does it work for you is the question. So labeling protocols are basically for you to be able to track your inventory. So different species, knowing where it was from, what year it's from, and be able to track that. If you've got a system that works for you, that's fine. I've got a system where mine uses, I don't get any in from other growers, but mine is basically the year, the month of collection, the location of collection, species, and seed zone, because I can never remember which one's which. So that's how I use it, but I think I might tweak that as the years go on, especially because eventually once you start using things like plant passports, you've got to provide your own sort of barcode or labeling system when you provide your plant passport. So it's just something to think about in the future. But if it works for you, that's fine. Andy, what do you use? Or Jacqui, what do you guys use?
What, for labels?
Yeah, like a labeling system.
Well, there's no fixed system at present. It's an evolving system. But I've had two different audits this year, one from UK ISG Woodland Trust and one from Plant Passports, and they both seem happy with my labeling system. And as you said, as long as it works for you and it makes sense to you. I mean, there are specific labels for the plant passports with your own code. Does it have the region of provenance on it? It doesn't, does it? It just has the species name, the botanical name, and the and your code. Yeah. yeah, as long as it works for you and you've got clear records. And some people's record keeping is better than others. You know, I just have a notebook in the nursery which I add to every time I do something, and it's, you know, got daily notes in it and some codes in it, but it's covered in compost and tea, and I don't have anything on the computer apart from my FRM records, and even they are not that great, to be fair. The new FRM system is not as good as it could be. Let's say in the old days, you filled out a form on a piece of paper and sent it to Scottish Forestry in Castorfin Road, and now you do it all online, and it's a nightmare. I'm just going to go back to filling out a form and send it to them, I think, with a stamp on it. I think a lot of people can relate to that. Anyway.
Jacqui, what do you use for labelling protocols?
I just put the last 4 numbers of the master certificate on it. So I've got like a kind of whiteboard inside the tunnel with a plan on it of inside and outside and what's where, and then like a couple of lists of, at the moment the whiteboard's got the 2021 like oak and whatever its number is, you know, like the list of 2021 master certificate things, and then the list, not 21, 22, sorry. So I've just got the list of the numbers and I just use the last 4 digits of it, and that's what I've got on a wee sticker in the tray thing. I do use quite a lot of them, right enough. Like at one point every single tray had that, I don't know what you call them, like the kind of label stick things, the wee pointy ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I just use it. I'm not very good at it really, but again, you know, the inspections, the guys are really quite loose about everything like that.
I think,
like, can I make sure the day before they come, I go back over them all with my black marker.
I think for me it's a lot more simple because all my seed collections are on Mull, and invariably for each species there's only one collection. You know, it might be in a fairly large area on Mull, but it's registered as one collection, so I don't have multiple collections for each species. So it makes my labeling system very simple compared to you, Alana. You know, you've probably got collections all over the country, and they need to be separated in the nursery.
Yeah, that is very different because I've got multiple seed zones, and within the seed zones, multiple sizes as well. So I've got to be a little bit more detailed with mine, mostly for my own reading, because it was so easy, and so it doesn't take a long time to lose track.
I couldn't deal with that.
Yeah, it's a challenge, but it's good to sort of figure out, and once you get the system in that works, then that's good.
Yeah, I mean, mine are all just collected here as well, just the same, so I don't have that many.
Yeah, and you're sort of supplying locally as well.
Yeah.
Which is useful. There was a question about the use of mycorrhizal fungi. No is the answer for me. I'd thought about it. So this is something that I've come across before about using mycorrhiza when sowing trees or even planting them out. I can recommend an excellent book called Finding the Mother Tree by Dr. Suzanne Samarge. She's a Canadian researcher who basically discovered the extent and network of mycelium and the mycorrhizal network that trees use to communicate and share resources. And she talks about planting plans failing because she started out in sort of working for commercial clear-cut plantation forestry in Canada when she was young, when she was studying, and noticed that saplings weren't thriving when they were being planted, and eventually through all of that and her research found out the importance of sort of mycorrhizal network and how different species need each other to support each other. So my answer to that really would be to definitely go read that book because it's brilliant, but also that I think the question is a lot more nuanced and has everything to do with factors from sort of the effects of weather during growing conditions in, you know, in the nursery, through to site prep and sort of site history when things are planted out, and the mixture of trees that are planted out. I am interested in sort of doing a bit more sort of researchy type stuff on this myself, because I'm a bit of a nerd. I love research, and there is a company called Rhizocore that has produced something that is fungal based, that is supplied with trees being planted out. So I'd like to get in touch with them and find out a little bit more. But currently the answer is no, I don't use anything.
The only thing I do is I incorporate some of the topsoil from the croft into my growing media. Very, you know, I might put a litre in for every 30 litres or something. And because the trees I'm growing are being planted in the local area, I think that it's got to be doing something to make those trees more adapted to the particular growing conditions. And I think that's where local nurseries can really, you know, help, like what Jacqui's doing. She's growing trees there to plant out on Knoydart. So, but a big nursery can maybe take samples of soil from the site where the trees are going to be planted and incorporate them into grain mix. I mean, that's how it works, isn't it? You know, the mycorrhizal fungi are going to be in, you know, in that soil anyway. So yeah, I mean, I just do a very simple thing like that, and I think it helps. Whether it does or not, I don't know, but it works for me. And and the trees I grow well, probably better than the ones they're buying in from the big nurseries that might be local provenance seed, but they're growing in a fairly sterile compost with Osmocote, you know.
Yeah, you've got a massive benefit having that existing soil there to use.
Yeah.
Which will definitely make a difference for sure. It's a great question, and I can see, Matthew, you've put a link to Rhizocore in the chat, which is great. I am intending to get in touch, because I think it's a fascinating subject, and we don't know very much about this, really, especially not in a nursery context. We don't know enough, so I think there's plenty of scope for playing around and experimenting with this further. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Using leaf mulch is for that reason.
Yeah. I mean, I mulch my beds in the garden with all the leaf litter off the trees from the nursery, and all the acorn cups and the hazelnut husks. When I separate them, I keep them in a bag, and they all go on top of the hazel and the oak beds as a mulch, and that's got to help as well, you know.
Yeah, and it's great because you're using a resource that you already have. It's not a waste. It's not a waste material. This is actually really valuable material. So it's a really good point, actually, keeping all of that as a resource rather than a waste product. Yeah. Okay. Unless there are any other questions, I think I'll call this to an end just now. Really appreciate everyone staying. We've come way over time. This is the first time doing this as well, so hopefully it was useful. If you want to stick in the chat any ideas for future workshops, anything else that would be really useful for you guys, is worth us knowing. Maybe we can help develop that. So do stick any suggestions in the chat if we've got any. Other than that, thank you so much to everybody for coming today. Thank you so much to Andy and Jacqui for presenting and sharing their experience. It's been
Thank you for organising it all and hosting it.
Yeah, no, it's really delighted to have done this. So thanks, folks. This has been recorded, and I will save it, I hope. And if I can share it, I will. But I've not done this side of the presentations before, so bear with me if I can't figure it out. I will try though. But thanks everybody, and hopefully see you in the Facebook group network or elsewhere. Thanks everyone.